There is a place in northwestern Saudi Arabia where the desert has literally been split in two. A trench stretching 170 kilometers cuts through the landscape from end to end. It is not a meteor crater, nor is it a geological fault. It is what remains of the most expensive, most ambitious, and most astonishingly unrealistic project ever attempted by humanity. This is the Line. And in November of last year, the world discovered what many had already suspected. Construction had stopped. Tens of billions of dollars had been spent. Entire communities had been forcibly displaced. Landscapes had been irreversibly altered. And a massive trench in the middle of nowhere stood as the only visible legacy. But the story does not end there, because what happened afterward is even more revealing than the collapse itself. Before understanding the end, we need to understand how something so absurd got so far. And the answer begins with a single man. Mohammed bin Salman was 31 years old when he became the most powerful man in Saudi Arabia, the crown prince of a kingdom, sitting on roughly 1/3 of the world's oil reserves. And he had one idea in mind: oil will eventually run out, or at least it will stop being the world's most important resource. His answer was NEOM, a special economic zone the size of an entire country, built from scratch in the desert. And at the heart of NEOM was its centerpiece, the Line, a city 170 kilometers long, 200 meters wide, and 500 meters tall. A linear city covered in mirrors, rising from the desert. No cars, no streets, no pollution. 9 million people living inside a structure resembling a gigantic blade stretching toward the horizon. It looked like something straight out of a video game, and there was a reason for that. According to the Financial Times, which obtained internal documents and spoke with sources involved in the project, decisions within NEOM's leadership were made largely on the basis of 3D renderings. Feasibility studies, detailed engineering plans, and realistic cost analyses were often pushed aside. And the person driving much of it was bin Salman himself. Sources say that many of the Line's most extravagant features, its unrealistic scale, its shape, and some of its most ambitious design elements came directly from him. It was a project built on vision, not reality. But there is a difference between having a vision and actually building it in the desert. And when engineers entered the picture, the questions became much harder to answer. To understand why the Line was physically impossible to construct within the promised timeline and scale, forget the huge numbers for a moment. Let's talk about glass. The exterior of the Line was supposed to be completely covered with mirrored panels. It looked stunning in the renderings. But how much mirrored glass would that actually require? Today, there is a building called Marriott Concert Hall, which holds the title of the world's largest mirrored structure. Building it was an engineering achievement. Each panel had to be manufactured with millimeter-level precision in both shape and surface quality to create the illusion of a single continuous mirror. The panels also required carefully calculated spacing so they could expand and contract under the extreme desert heat without cracking. Marriott uses 9,740 square meters of mirrored glass. The Line would require 170 million square meters of mirrored glass. That is more than 17,000 times the current world record. And there simply is not enough manufacturing capacity on Earth to produce that amount. The world's largest glass coating manufacturer would need an entire year to produce enough material for just 1,800 meter section of the structure. To cover the entire facade, it would take roughly 200 years. And glass was only one of the problems. Steel was another. At one point during the foundation work, NEOM's investment director revealed that the project was consuming around 20% of the world's total steel production, just for the foundations before a single floor had even been built. If you attempted to scale that up for the complete structure, global steel prices would likely surge, making the project even more expensive than it already was. And the costs were already staggering. Initial estimates put the price at $500 billion. Later, that figure rose to $1 trillion. Then internal projections reportedly reached numbers that were never officially disclosed, but sources described them as being in the multiple trillions of dollars. Even so, The excavators kept working for years because stopping also carried a cost, and not just a financial one. There is a concept in behavioral economics known as the sunk cost fallacy. In simple terms, the more you invest in something, the harder it becomes to walk away from it, even when stopping is clearly the right decision. Saudi Arabia experienced this phenomenon on a monumental scale. While doubts were growing internally, the machines continued operating, and the work that had already been completed was far from trivial. Satellite images and drone footage confirmed large-scale excavation along nearly the entire planned 170-kilometer route. But excavation was only part of the story. Around the project, especially in the Gayal area, where the first phase was supposed to be built, an entire infrastructure ecosystem emerged. Concrete precast factories were constructed specifically for the line. Power plants were built. Gas processing facilities were established. Residential communities were created to house workers. The project also launched what was described as the largest pile driving operation in the world, as well as the most extensive groundwater lowering system ever constructed, required to work in the water-saturated soil near the Red Sea. Financially, estimates suggest that approximately $50 billion had already been spent by the time construction effectively came to a halt. And that was before any significant vertical structure had actually been built. Meanwhile, the foreign investment that was supposed to finance a large portion of the project simply never arrived. A risk analyst interviewed by the international press put it bluntly: investors simply were not buying the Crown Prince's vision for Saudi Arabia. In 2024, the layoffs began. First came senior leaders, then entire teams. More than 1,000 NEOM employees were dismissed, and the CEO of the line simply stopped posting updates on LinkedIn. When the leader of a project stops talking about it, you already know what comes next. But what nobody knew yet was what to do with everything that had already been built. A 170-kilometer trench carved through the desert, factories with no purpose, worker communities with no project left to build. So what does Saudi Arabia do with all of it now? The honest answer is, it depends. The trench itself will probably remain exactly as it is for decades. There is no obvious use for it, and filling it back in would cost billions of dollars. It may become one of the greatest monuments to human excess ever created, visible from space, empty on the inside. The precast concrete factories built exclusively for the line will likely shut down. Without the project, there is little reason for them to exist in the middle of the desert. Some facilities, however, have a real chance of surviving. The gas processing plant can continue operating. The demand for gas is not going away. The power generation systems could, in theory, be connected to Saudi Arabia's national electrical grid, although doing so would require building transmission corridors across hundreds of kilometers of remote territory. The airport planned for the region, on the other hand, will almost certainly never be built. There is simply no economic logic behind constructing a major airport in the middle of nowhere. Then there are the worker communities. Here we find one of the most interesting possibilities currently being discussed behind the scenes. Saudi Arabia is scheduled to host the 2034 FIFA World Cup, a fixed and immovable deadline. The country needs to build stadiums, infrastructure, and housing for tens of thousands of workers. Some of the residential communities originally built for NEOM could potentially be repurposed for exactly that purpose. And the stadium that had been planned for the line, literally suspended hundreds of meters above the ground, obviously will not be built in that form. However, a conventional stadium at ground level, making use of the roads and infrastructure already constructed around the project, could still make practical sense. A stadium in the middle of the desert for a World Cup? Only Saudi Arabia could make that seem plausible. But the line was never the only project within NEOM, and the fate of its other components is equally revealing about what is really happening to Mohammed bin Salman's vision. NEOM was always more than the line. It was an entire ecosystem of projects, each more ambitious than the last. What happened to them? Sindola was arguably the most realistic of them all, a luxury island resort in the Red Sea. From an engineering perspective, there was nothing extraordinary about it, just expensive and sophisticated. Yet even Sindola stumbled. The island has still not opened to the public, and internal reports suggest that bin Salman himself was dissatisfied with the outcome and ordered work to be halted. Golf courses that once appeared lush and green in promotional renderings now appear in recent satellite imagery with dried grass and little maintenance. Oxagon, the octagon-shaped floating industrial city, is an even greater mystery. A green hydrogen facility is reportedly around 80% complete, but the main floating island is barely visible in satellite imagery. What can be seen is an expanded port in the region, with a Belgian construction company reportedly responsible for much of the recent progress. Container terminal operations are expected to begin during 2026. And then there is Trojena, the ski resort planned for the mountains of Saudi Arabia. It has become perhaps the ultimate symbol of the gap between ambition and reality. The project had even been selected to host the 2029 Asian Winter Games. In January 2025, Trojena's chief executive was still publicly stating that the absolute priority was delivering the project in time for the Games. Just weeks later, Kazakhstan announced that it would replace Saudi Arabia as the host of the competition. NEOM officials declined to comment on whether the project was still on schedule. That response or lack of one says everything. What all of these projects had in common was that they were conceived using the same logic as the line: vision before feasibility, image before engineering. And 2026 may be the year when NEOM is finally forced to look into the mirror, the very mirror that was supposed to cost trillions and was never installed. It is tempting to conclude that the line was simply a failure, an epic waste of money, a vanity project that deserved to collapse. But the real story is more complicated and more interesting than that. Saudi Arabia spent roughly $50 billion and permanently transformed hundreds of kilometers of desert before pausing the project. That is not failing before you start. That is failing halfway through, after already creating one of the largest excavation projects in human history. And here lies the paradox. Even if the line is never completed, the project has already produced real and irreversible consequences. Communities were forcibly displaced, including members of the Hawitat tribe, who reported threats and violence against those who refused to leave. Ecosystems were altered. Resources were diverted away from other national priorities. On the other hand, some of the infrastructure that was built may still be repurposed. The technical knowledge gained from working at unprecedented scales has value. And the failure of the line itself may force a healthier recalibration of Saudi Arabia's megaproject ambitions, with more realism and fewer 3D renderings. But perhaps the line's most important legacy is this: it demonstrated, in real time, what happens when absolute power collides with absolute physical limits. Mohammed bin Salman had money, authority, and vision. What he did not have was a way to bend the laws of engineering, logistics, and economics. A 170-kilometer trench in the desert, $50 billion spent, and perhaps the most expensive lesson of recent history: grandeur is not the same thing as feasibility. The line may have ended, but the question it leaves behind will last far longer than any skyscraper ever could. Can the line still happen? Or is it finished for good? That is a question the world may be debating for decades to come.